I thought we would begin. I would get us started by asking Jose a question or two. And one of the things that as you read his book, you will find compelling, particularly if you are or have been a teacher, is the very real portraits of the teachers and students in the class. And for example, he talks at some length about a colleague of his who eventually died of cancer, who he was very fond of, but he begins the description by talking about her bellowing at the top of her lungs. And I'm like, when I read that sentence, I'm like, uh-oh, what's coming next? But it doesn't at all follow the stereotype. She actually turns out to be this incredibly warm and generous woman and teacher. And so the question that I have, Jose, is that you've chosen to write about people, on the one hand, students that are, entirely boys and girls of color. On the other hand, teachers who are perhaps the most stereotyped and the most vilified in American popular culture and in American political culture. You don't have to reflect very much on recent events to understand how a popular perception of young men of color has played out in a very particularly tragic way. And anyone who's a teacher these days certainly understands that, we now occupy the place in political culture that Reagan created with the welfare queen in the 1970s and 1980s. And so how do you approach writing about these people who occupy that place, and do you worry about, or feel some sort of obligation to try to struggle against those images?
Well, I think it starts from not apologizing and knowing that with that non apology, I also have to be careful with everything that I'm putting out there. So it's a binary thing, but they work in tandem. So whenever I do say something, it comes from a place where we're all learning. And there are things that I've said a lot of things. I don't think I've apologized. Well, I say I'll apologize for maybe like 1% of them, but the other 99% came from a place that I wanted people to grow and learn from. So the description of the teacher, for instance, I was trying to get at this idea that yes, she had her flaws. Yes, she also had her triumphs, but none of that takes away from this human reality that yes, there is this nuance about what is happening in her persona, and she came into the classroom with her own set of things and her own set of issues, and she still triumphed in that classroom because people generally cared about her. She cared about the students in front of her. The students definitely cared about her, even though there were those flaws. And yet, any one of I guess hundreds of people within whatever debate there is will just pick and choose whatever there is in this person to say, oh, well, this person was a good teacher because, or this person was a bad teacher because, and then all of a sudden she passes away and it's like, oh, well, we need to honor her memory because this, that, whatever, which happened in my school. And I just kept saying to myself, maybe some of you weren't that nice to her when she was alive. So, but maybe you need to back off that. Versus me, I felt like I'm coming from a place that, yes, I struggled with my relationship with her, as you can probably tell in the book. If you've read it already, if you haven't, you'll read it yourself. But there was this bottom line of we worked together well because we did have that struggle and we were honest. And I was able to come in and say, you know what? There's this line where I say, was she beneficial for the students? Did the students respect her? Did they love her? Yes, they did. And it came from a very warm place for her. So I just kept thinking to myself, how do I describe her very well? It's just by coming from a place where, yes, I'm honest. And it just came from within. I said, let me just let it, flourish there. Let me just sit in that and, wallow in that feeling about her and just put it on the page. And I think you'll get similar feelings about the other people who are described in the book. You never get like this good, bad, good, bad. You always get like, this is what happened. And I'm hoping you can kind of glean how I feel about the person from what you're reading there.
I just want to say, Jose, that the one thing that will attract teachers to this book is the honesty throughout. Even in the way you talk about, you approach conversations about race, gender, poverty, difference, because we are basically recruiting teachers all over the nation who are coming into classrooms with students who do not look like them, did not come from the same place. The differences socioeconomically, race-wise, class-wise. And I had the opportunity to talk to about 700 new teachers we recruited this year, and the audience was 75% white. And I had to say, without fear, that I hope that all of you understand that the students that you're going to be confronted with when you go to your schools will not look like you. They'll come from different places, but they're not empty vessels. And your book basically gives teachers their voice. They will find their own voice in this book. But it also gives teachers a safe place to begin having conversations with each other about what we need to do as educators in order to prepare to teach our students, all of our students, with the same level of expectation that we would if we were teaching in our hometowns or any place else. And the second thing is the idea of you're having a voice as a teacher who is still in the classroom, because many teachers do not believe that they're afraid to express some of the thoughts they have about social injustices they experience right in their own schools. And what they realize along the way is that basically they become the voice of students who have no voice, whose parents cannot advocate as well as others, and that they are really the frontline advocates for students in social justice. So you said in your book that our classrooms basically is a laboratory for social justice and how we teach our students, and we've got to do it in an honest way. And that will certainly resonate for teachers in this school district, and I want to thank you for that.
That means a lot. Thanks.
Okay, let's throw it open.
I'm wondering, as a teacher who's kind of working with the students every day, what you think would be, say, the top 3 policies we need to follow to ensure that all students get a quality education?
Goodness, my top 3 ever, my top 3 right now. Right? It's always swimming. But number 1 always ends up going back to equitable funding. And I don't mean like 70, 100%. I don't mean it's even 80, 100%. I mean 100%, 100%. No matter what school you go to, the difference shouldn't be in funding. The difference should be in style. If there is a sense that, people want to have, I guess, a more rigid curriculum, by all means, you take your child there. I mean, that seems to be some people gravitate towards that more, and that might be the hallmark for them of what a good education is. I guess that's a choice. If you want a more liberal, progressive education where people are more exploring more, something in the model of a John Dewey or even a Deborah Meyer, then that is the choice too. But those 2 schools shouldn't have different funding systems. They should all have the same equitable funding, because that is the bedrock of how our children learn and how our children grow up and perceive things. I often tell people that I don't think many people remember exactly what every teacher taught them. Maybe they know that they were supposed to be learning math during whatever classroom it is, but what they do remember is how the teacher approached them, how they made them feel, how did the school make them feel. And so if the school doesn't make you feel good, then you're not going to have a sense of, I guess, pride about that school, regardless. So I think, funding obviously has a lot to do with that, because there are all these stressors for how we fund our schools. But then number 2, right now, thinking back to what I just said about the disparity between students of color and our current teacher workforce would be some sort of, I wouldn't say sensitivity training, more about race-conscious PD, especially in schools with that sort of large disparity. So we need to close that gap by having better conversations around race, gender, class, and then bringing back in that conversation about high expectations, because that word has been modeled throughout all of these debates. What does that actually look like in a classroom where we can still talk about the other like nitty gritty pieces of community? And I guess number three, I think we would just go back to having um, a more balanced sense of curricula. Like, what does it mean to not focus strictly on math and English throughout the whole year? What does it mean to actually have a well-rounded school where every subject feels not just supported but also integral to the school's success? These things where we say math and English are primary, and then you're able to take away gym and talent and art for the purposes of getting more minutes for math and ELA, where that may or may not help out at all. As a matter of fact, in my experience, I don't feel like taking away gym periods has been very helpful for our kids. So if that's the case, then we probably need to retool how it looks like to have all these physical activities and mental exercises and things that kids actually want to go to school for more often than not. We need to restructure that in a very big way. So I think that's the policy end of things.
What do you think about the role of testing?
I mean, it's obviously popular to say that I think testing is overrated and overdone and it's overburdening. I think also, though, it's not just about being anti-testing. It's also about being a better assessment of our students. So if we can find better ways to assess how our students learn and how our students are measured, then we will do a much better job for our kids overall. So it's not just saying, okay, we want to decrease the amount of bubble tests that they take. Instead, we ought to say, here's a plan for how we can better assess our students. We could do it through performance-based assessment, which is already out there. I know that a couple of you already are familiar with that sort of model where you can present your case. I'm sure there's got to be a bunch of different ways to do it besides just saying, here, take a test, and this is the end of it, and so be it.
Yeah. First, I'd like to actually hear Liz answer the same question that you just had about the top 3 policy pieces that you would like to see as a classroom teacher and now as a union leader. And then, Jose, for you, I'd like to hear what you're going to write about next. What's the next book?
Ladies first.
Okay, so this is a test. And actually, the answer is short. It's the same thing that Jose said. One of the things, a curriculum equity and funding for schools. And I don't mean just giving all schools the same amount of dollars. Talking about staff, leadership in the school, and of course, the wraparound services that students need in some parts of the city that other students may not need because they have that support at home. So I would absolutely have to say that it would be the way schools are resourced, the way they are staffed, after visiting 92 schools last year as president of the union and talking to the teachers in those 92 schools, hearing what resources they had available, hearing that their students were only able to take English and math for the whole day, no recess, 5 or 10 minutes recess, 25-minute lunch periods, no PE, no social studies, no science. That's not fair. And for us to pretend that all schools in the city or in any school district are getting the same resources and that the children have access to the same opportunities to learn would be criminal. And basically we would become facilitators of the crime. So as a teacher who have taught in 9 schools in DC since my career started in whatever year, I know that there is a huge disparity in how those schools are resourced because I intentionally stayed in schools in Ward 7 and 8. And my transfers were never voluntary. The only one I had in 44 years was from Michelle Rhee, believe it or not. She asked me not to write any more op-eds. So the second thing I would have to say is the excessive testing. And as an administrator of tests in every school I've attended or taught in, I was always said, you manage students well. I had a chance to observe up close and personal what it does to students when they're in a test all day for 5 and 6 consecutive days. They really retaliate by saying, to hell with this. I'm not doing it anymore, and they bubble anything. And quite frankly, I want to join them sometimes because I think it's disastrous what we do to children with the test and what we're doing to teachers in order to get a bump on a test score. We are actually mandating that they teach the test prep, after school, test prep. It is not teaching, folks, and the teachers who are passionate about their work know that it's not teaching. And of course, there are teachers who are at the brink of saying we're going to opt out, but we've got to begin to look at alternative ways of measuring students' performance. We have students who learn differently, they assess differently. And if we're really smart, and if we're really, truly educators, we will begin to realize that doing more of the same is not going to yield any better results. So, and of course, teacher evaluation would be my third item of the day. Teacher evaluation is supposed to support teachers in building their craft and basically becoming better at what they do. If you have an evaluation system that basically turns teachers out as fast as we recruit them, something is wrong. Take a look at what it might be, and don't cling to what's happening like you own it. Admit when something is not working. We have a teacher evaluation system that is basically punitive. We have the highest teacher turnover rate in the nation. We recruited 3,200 teachers since Michelle Riggs, so we should not have a problem with bad teachers anymore. We've killed them all off. So if we have 3,200 new teachers out of a staff of 4,000, we may want to begin to look at some other reasons about why we cannot retain them. So those are my three top issues.
I'm sorry, can you just repeat your question? Because I was all of.
What's your next book?
How? Well, I've struggled a little bit, but I mean, the next one's gonna be about asking difficult questions of everything and everybody. I've been known to be a bit of a provocateur, so I think I'm gonna go that angle and see where it leads me. I'm not exactly sure where I'm gonna end up, but I do know that I wanna ask critical questions again, not because I have some sort of agenda, but because I think we need to ask ourselves better questions about how we approach schooling and education as a whole. So I think that might be the next one.
Jose, you're very active on social media.
I've heard.
And it's,
Okay.
it's terrific. Is this something that other teachers respond to and are engaged, and you see this as an important mobilizing tool? Is it, I guess, how is it that that teachers can get even more engaged and more involved in making their voices heard in the way that you have?
I always say don't be me, because there are times, and I have Melinda in the audience, so she knows it can get dangerous sometimes. So to that end, I think there's something that I do which helps me bridge the gap that I keep talking about between the teachers in the classroom and then everybody else having the highfalutin conversations. No disrespect to anybody here. But what I end up talking about is look inside my classroom, look and see what's happening. And these are the characters that you all keep playing in the media. And I'm gonna point you to what's actually happening. Let me dish you out a couple of things that may be unpopular to everybody over here, including people who I consider allies, people who are in the back of my book, people who are in the front of my book. I mean, it doesn't matter. Like, I gotta have these conversations because social media has become a tool for me to accelerate a voice that I already have. So it did start with blogging, which was awesome. Like I was never able to speak to you. I didn't felt like I could speak to central staff over in UFT until I got my blog. So there was that. And then I was able to forge, I would say, friendships between folks that were there. And then that was one bridge, but then it became, all right, let me try to bridge a gap between me and my central staff at DOE. A couple years later, after I started my blog, it got blocked. So that was fun too. But then, of course, it also made me think, okay, so that means that they're actually listening, but they're having a hard time enacting what I'm talking about. You know what I mean? So if I would suggest that teachers who are using it know what they're getting into, but then once they get into it, they have to go full in, and they have to be prepared to have those conversations, even if it's not exactly like me. At the very least, know what they're getting into and have a message and learn how to like talk to the folk who they want to listen. Like they need to make sure they have those pieces, and that's a thing you learn over time. Like I was fairly raw when I first came into this electronic like social media world, but I think by now I have a sense of who my audience is and where I'm gonna go from here. See, you know what I mean? It's hard to navigate until I can talk to the actual person, because it is social media. If you're doing it like me, it is a personal thing where you're trying to navigate that. So you find your tools and you just build from there. Unless, of course, you just want to play it safe, then you can just tweet out 5 articles every day and you're so on and so forth. But that doesn't do anything for me.
Yes. Let's get the microphone. Because you will appear on screen.
I'm so excited.
Should be on.
Is there anything about, I noticed in the title, is there anything about testing in the book? What do you want to say about testing?
I mean, it's been a while since I've read the book. I will say this, because I've read it aloud more often than I've read it to myself. What I do talk about in the book about testing is the procedure and the things that people don't say about testing itself. Like there is a little bit about, I guess all the talking points that are out there. Like, we're over testing students. We're going away from curriculum. We need to do a better job of assessing things that we've talked about. But in the very beginning, you start seeing what exactly I'm talking about when I mean that students get stressed about testing. And what does that look like for the teacher administering the test that he doesn't believe in, and then how that gets reflected in the students themselves who also don't believe in the testing that they're about to get that ends up being pointless anyway. So, there is that element as well.
Yes.
You said something in the book about, in that first part, I believe she was reading about good charter schools. Some of them are good. Could you talk a little more about what you think is a good charter school and about the accountability and regulation of charter schools in general?
Oh, I don't think charter schools generally are getting as regulated as they ought to be. To the point where, at least from my perspective, in New York, and I'm sure it's happening in DC too, where they get carte blanche for practically everything. And a lot of the corruption that's happening within the administration, within charter schools, happening because people are saying, oh, look, I got charter schools into this public school system, into this stronghold of unionism. Look what I can do. Like, I'm so cool. That's what, and well, Liz Davis, if I may, because I used her first name, I apologize, I was born that way. I would say that when you're looking at charter schools, yes, there are a couple which I think are on the right track in terms of trying to serve at least a small segment of the community. Do I believe that about the chain charter schools like the Ewan Moskowitz? Absolutely not. Do I believe that about Jeffrey Canada? I thought so for a little bit until he dropped the whole 7th grade out of his school. Like, he literally knocked out the whole 7th grade because they wouldn't match the targets of his school. Then I said, that's just not the way to do it. Like, you're totally being disingenuous about your wraparound services if you're going to knock out a whole 7th grade instead of trying to work with them. And then you go out in the media and you say, oh, well, my school isn't about that. It isn't about testing and moving things that way. Yeah, it is, because this is what you do. And we have charters that counsel out kids on a regular basis. How does that work? Or you'll even have, let's say, if you have an incoming class of 6th grade, that's like 112 kids. And then you only have 32 kids that actually graduate out of those 112. What does that say about your school? And that doesn't serve us. That doesn't help us out in at all. Like I said, there are a couple that are doing, community work. But overall, I have this sense that the direction and the carte blanche that is given to them by people like Andrew Cuomo, people like Michelle V. Johnson, people, all these folks who say, oh, we're just trying to do better. We're just trying to innovate. What are you innovating? Are you innovating faster ways to get our kids out? And if that's your deal, then this is not the service for you. We need public schools because not only are they serving 90% of our of our kids in this country. It is the bedrock. It is the foundation of schooling, and we need to find a way to innovate within those spaces and give schools a way to innovate within that, instead of trying to say, "Oh, look, they're doing it way better than we are," even though they only get like 5% of our kids. See what I mean? That is that conversation, and people aren't having it. People are just saying bad charter schools instead of saying why they're not working as well as they should.
So, hi. I wonder if there's a way to kind of turn internally, and it's great because you have this beautiful platform and beautiful stage with the book. What are the ways in which we're getting in our own way? How are we tripping over our own feet? What are the fights that maybe we've brought with us that we can put down? And what are the changes we could see kind of internally, progressively, and kind of leftist and union and all of those pieces? What changes should we see there?
Thank you. I wanted to bring that up, actually. I think it's one of those things where, so, fine, somebody who we don't like, whoever that may be out there, whether it be Campbell Brown or whoever the evil boogeymen and women that are out there right now, comes out with something. It's major, and oh my gosh, all the media is focusing on it for now. And the first response from someone on the left is, wow, that's not the case. That's not the case at all. Look at what we're doing. We're so wrong. You know, it's always like this defensive mode instead of saying, let's be proactive. Like, let's get out right before these things happen and say, why are these things positive for us? How do we reinforce the public image that I would say about 76, I think, % of our public believes in their local teacher. Why is that? Because they get to talk to them. They're treating the students right. I mean, these are things that we don't have the conversation about enough. And so, if I think whatever we consider the left, right? Because that's a whole big thing here. Yeah, that's another book. So we have to get in front of a lot of these things, because that way, if we get out in front, they have to react to us, whatever that may be. So when it comes to tenure, one of the first things that I was asked, and Leo actually asked me about this, was how do we talk about tenure? And I said, all right, I'm gonna write a piece and try to plow through that as a teacher from a teacher lens, which again, we don't have enough of. Like, do we ask our public school teachers, or do we ask our parents, do we ask our students why it is that due process would matter, especially in places where they're constantly knocking down our schools, closing our schools. These are places where we need some sort of due process. And of course, if we're not having those conversations, then we let the Campbell Browns in very quickly. They're able to swindle the American public because they've already been on CNN, so of course they're experts. Duh. You know? These are things that I think we need to learn how to get in front of more instead of constantly reacting to. So teacher evaluation, maybe that's a quiet topic right now. We need to go back then, and maybe this left that we have here needs to get out in front of that conversation all over again, because it's gonna come right back, and there's gonna be another boogeyman out there who wants to make money off that, like a Steve Perry or whoever it is, and that's us. That has to be us. We need to be getting in front of things instead of trying to react to whatever that is that's out there.
So I have another question, which I thought one of the more powerful parts of your book was the way in which you reflected on your own experience as a student, a bilingual student, and how different schools and different teachers responded to you. And this theme of what should the school's relationship be to a student's heritage culture. And I thought maybe you would like to speak about that a little bit.
More than anything, schools ought to be the epicenter of a community. I think what gets lost a lot in this debate is that, you know, people say school choice, but who's choosing and where is the choice coming from? So in our school, well, in our district, for example, you can have one student who lives in, let's say, 200th Street, but gets sent down to a school on 125th, even though there's a perfectly fine school maybe a couple blocks away. This idea of equitable funding, going back to what Mrs. David had said, she mentions how if we don't have good equitable funding for all schools, then then it becomes a game of trying to get a student into whatever school, meeting some number, yada, yada, yada. But then there's no real choice. Like, we don't really understand what's going on. If we have a school that's the epicenter of that community, so I think I would say my school is a pretty good, a good example of this, in that our school isn't just based on talking to other Dominicans. It's also about, like, cultural pieces. We open our schools up very often. We have a community-based service that comes in, and they also do work with the community. We have bilingual classes for our parents. Our parent community is very active within our school. Even if we did get a couple of co-locations, we have a high school on the 5th floor, a high school on the 4th floor, 2 separate high schools. And that's all DOE nonsense. But we still maintain that relationship with our parents because that's critical for us. We return, in return, we give them classes and they give us their support. I mean, that's the relationship that we ought to have with all the parents around us. Even when our band, and we have one of the few middle school bands in the entire city, but that band, even when they're practicing, like blaring, like horns, trumpets, drums, the whole nine, and they're blasting them outside at, let's say, like 7:30, the community responds positively because they know it's a benefit to the students, which and everybody understands what's going on. It's never an interruption. There used to be a time when people used to throw eggs at the kids during prom. That doesn't happen anymore. It hasn't happened the last 6 years, ever since our principal said, you know what, we need to have this because our kids deserve this. Our kids deserve a nice prom. They deserve to have a nice track and field. They deserve to have these things. And if you're able to have a community-based school that really cares about the kids, even if it sacrifices a lot in their budget, I think what you start seeing is that the community responds with, we are going to affirm this school. No matter what their test scores are, then we know what's happening within there because you've invited us in, so we have to respond affirmatively to that. I don't know how many schools out there are like that. I mean, I was very fortunate in that my middle school, which I think Leo was also referring to, Nativity Mission, Catholic school, real small. It was housed in a real small building, but everyone agreed that it was one of the landmarks, or unofficial landmarks, for our community. Like, the parents threw themselves in there. They would cook our lunches. We didn't have public school lunches, so they had to come in and cook in the kitchen, whatever kitchen it was. We never had a problem with parents coming in, showing up for field trips, showing up for parent-teacher conferences, because they bought into the system. All of us were poor. I mean, that's what it was. Like, we were all poor Black and Latino children, but it was a benefit to us because the parents believed, the students believed, we all believed in that system. And I think that's something that can be scalable to our general public school system, no matter how large, because that's the relationship we ought to build with everyone.
I totally agree, and I just want to say that having the parents come in for bilingual classes, and I'm sitting here reflecting on how we have attempted to implement cultural understanding and diversity in school and tolerance and all of the wonderful things that we've talked about since multicultural education became a buzzword. But for some reason it evolved into this thing where teachers believe that having a celebration for one day, or 1 month out of the year is sufficient, and it's a bothersome unit that we need to put aside after February, or Hispanic Heritage Month. Parents are never seen, never engaged. And of course, I do have hope after visiting several schools in the surrounding jurisdictions, as well as here in DC, where parents were invited in during the day. They came to school and they could actually stay. They stayed for breakfast. They actually had classes in the school for parents, language classes, and it made such a difference. 2 schools, particularly in Baltimore, which are community schools, completely turned around because of that very thing that you just talked about. The parent engagement, authentic parent engagement, not that superficial PTA 1 month stand and get out, or when you come into the school, it's usually because your child is in trouble, but where parents are invited and feel welcome in the schools no matter what their ethnicity is. So I think that that's going to be an ingredient that we may need to look at very closely in DC as we continue to, the field is changing. Classrooms are changing, the teaching force is changing. But our methodology for orienting teachers to what we need to be and engaging parents on a real, authentic level is something that we're going to have to work at. So you've just confirmed for me the importance of forging powerful alliances with the parents, because that is certainly one of the main ingredients.
So I'll ask one of those hard questions.
Thank you.
How do you get teachers, white teachers, to acknowledge privilege? And then once they do, how do you think that affects how they teach?
I think there's levels to this. Obviously, I've learned how to fine tune a strategy where I do go through a set of questions for folks to maybe one by one just try to get them into a conversation about trying to get them out of themselves and into the eyes of people who are looking at them. For instance, there was this issue with a school in Queens, I believe it was, with that were wearing the NYPD T-shirts on the first day of school. Through, in their perspective, they may have felt that, supporting teachers was a thing for them. And I mean, supporting police officers was a thing for them, and that's fine. And some of them have relationships with the NYPD on their own. I mean, that's all well and good until you start realizing that their students may have felt another way, especially in light of events that have happened in the summer, starting from Eric Gardner, but it could have even gone way even before then. Trayvon Martin, Jordan Davis, Renisha McBride. I mean, I'm talking about a whole history of things. And, there is this idea that if you're aligning yourself to another agent of the state, then that becomes like, oh, I can't trust you either. So I'm trying to come into a school and I'm already seeing PD right in front of me. Like, you're aligning yourself with them. Oh my goodness, I can't be, this is not a safe place for me. And then the minute that teacher starts saying something in an authoritative way, then all that does is give them that same lens that they see NYPD with. Even if their individual relationships with individual police officers may have been better than whatever's out there, the general sentiment around a lot of our communities is the police cannot be trusted. I mean, let's be honest, right? So I think there has to be a sense of, let's have that conversation around what the students look at when they see you, and how then you turn that around and then try to build a relationship with that student. And then, of course, there's always the, bludgeon them until they totally get it. But that's worked to a lesser degree. And you I think it also, the thing is too, like, as someone who's of color, like, I always feel like, am I gonna have to be the one to have that conversation? And I don't always have to want to be that person. So if I can get other people to also have that conversation, so I can take a break and, like, tag team out. It's like, okay, why don't you take care of this one, and we'll move from there. But generally, it's about coming in and saying, okay, this is who I am as a person. Like, I have this background from this person. This is my perspective. This is my relationship. And then building from there and saying, okay, coming from that perspective, this is what I think. And then saying, okay, this is how others may perceive. I think there's a sense of empathy there once you start taking yourself out of yourself and start seeing how other people may look at you, how people may question the actions that you have. And I think everybody ought to have that lens, but specifically if you're in a position where people look at you and say, this person has a certain privilege that I do not, or this person has a way of approaching things and has access to a society that I don't often have percentage-wise. So, I mean, those are things that I always struggle with. And sometimes I do want to bludgeon it. Sometimes I know I can't. But but generally, it's about having the conversation and being willing to have it. Both parties need to have it in a very major way, and people need to let their guard down in a very major way. That was good.
So, is there another question? Okay. Why don't we, if there are no other questions, why don't we end, Jose? You say that you like to read from your book. Why don't you take a short selection from your book and read that, and we'll finish with that.
Do you mind if I read two of them, y'all? Can I do that? Sure. Yay. I'll do one classroom, and then since I'm in D.C., I might as well take it back to the title of the book. This first one is called God Got Jokes, Son. If you're following along, it's on page 129. My first real classroom activity with 8th graders was a complete failure. It was like stepping on your shoelaces while walking, having your knees buckle under you, and letting your face fall flat on a huge cream pie with a live studio audience waiting for you to say, "Did I do that?" Idealist as I am, when I first strutted into the classroom, I thought I'd pick up a piece of chalk and automatically get the respect necessary to make the remaining 179 days left in the school year smooth sailing. I chose an activity that I was certain would make these garrulous 8th graders see themselves as mathematicians and scientists in no time. After all, they were classified as alpha students, as in high achievers. In retrospect, I should have stuck with Gary Rubinstein's reluctant disciplinarian and kept it simple and plain. This transformative teaching was much harder than I originally thought. I'm still wiping cream off my face. The activity involved dividing the students into groups and giving each group a piece of chart paper. I then asked them to write down occupations in which math was absolutely necessary. When it came time to share what they came up with, almost every group responded with something that involved drugs. A synchronicity that cracked them up, but that bothered me deeply. "Don't you all have high expectations?" I asked them. "Aren't you supposed to be alpha students?" Azam, the class clown, said, "Yeah, but just because we're alpha students doesn't mean we're smart." "No, but he's definitely a smartass. I wanted to respond just like that, but I had to let it go and wallow in the cream pie, sticking to my goatee. I realized I was going to have to reveal more of my personality, the one that had made it through decades of being surrounded by wannabe drug dealers and kleptomaniacs. I'd simply have to inject a little more sarcasm into my classroom persona. Then they would bow down to my humor and linguistic prowess, and I would conquer them all. But first, I tried on my 7th graders. Sometime around December, we were studying geometric figures when a young gentleman, a 7th grade class clown, said to me, "Mr. Vilson, I bet I can make you laugh." "Okay." "Why was 6 afraid of 7? "Because 7, 8, 9, get it?" Mild chuckles followed, but not from me. If there was ever a time to get the class clown, it was here. "Michael, that joke is older than World War II. That was whack." Just like that, my mask had come undone. The whole class cracked up. It was uproarious. Michael laughed along, but he also looked a little bit like a walking stop sign. I felt bad for a second, but after that, I had his respect, as well as that of the rest of the class. Now they think twice before coming into my classroom with weak jokes. Ain't no half-stepping. The moment to get even with Zam came a month later, when we were getting into the meat of 8th grade math, transformations. By that point, I had called every one of my 8th graders' parents at least twice, and I hadn't cracked so much as a half smile. As a young Black-Latino male teacher, I often get the question, "So are you married?" Naturally, I would say yes. And they'd say, "To whom?" "Her name is Math," and I'd replied, "Now get back to work." They either laughed or rolled their eyes with their corny math teacher, but on this day, Azan decided he'd test me further. Since his crack about alpha students, he had consistently annoyed the heck out of me every chance he got. Even when he was doing well in class, I often had to call his house for some knuckleheaded thing he had done, or not done. On this day, he came up to me and said, "So, Mr. Vilson, guess what?" "Yes, Azam." "I was doing your wife last night. She was really good." The rest of the class laughed and stared at me, awaiting my reaction. I furrowed my lower lip, nodding my head while everyone got their giggles in. Then I said, "Funny you should say that, because I talked to my wife last night, and she said you didn't do her very well." "Oh," yelled the class. The crowd went wild. I couldn't help but add, "That's why she came back to me." More giggles. Azam just hung his head and went back to work, thinking of a comeback at his desk. I probably went overboard, and I only slightly regret it. Actually, I don't, but I'll say I do just so people don't think I'm any less of an educator. After that, Azam and I exchanged funny barbs for the rest of the year. The more ridiculous we became, the more I looked at him less as a student and more as a son. Thank you. Ta-da. So I think there's, oh yeah. I'm in DC, so I think there was also a moment where somebody asked me about when I started doing this thing. 2011 Save Our Schools March. I'm sure some of you have heard of it. Some of you have maybe seen the video or whatever. That's kind of when things started catapulting a bit. And I said, oh, I can actually move people with words. Freaking awesome. So this is when I started really getting into things, protesting, getting active, and getting out there. I'm going to preface it a little bit by saying that when Taylor Mali, I'm sure who you've heard, and we're being honest here. I know I'm on camera, but whatever. He had read a poem, his usual, what teachers make, and it was cool and all that. But I felt at the time that it didn't address the anger and I guess the feeling at that moment of what it was to be an educator in these times of testing. So I started boiling in, and this is where you're coming in. If you're following along, it's on page 165, that first open sentence. I sat down and tried to tune into my inner teacher. I sought what my friend and educator Alexa Munoz called the rage, that part of your heart that yells back at people or ideas that conflict with what you feel to be true or right. It's when you have an 8th grade English language learner who is subjected to more than a test a week from April to June just in order to graduate. It's when you hear the president claim to appreciate educators of all stripes while reinforcing ideas from the previous administration. An administration, mind you, that was supposed to be much worse on education issues. It's when you decide for once to take the culmination of struggle and indignation and mold it into electricity, the type of energy that sparks ideas and lights up classrooms at once. It's when you give your one spectacular speech in the classroom that you saved just for the right occasion. The lull when students don't work to their fullest potential, the speech that sets the stage for you to catch your second wind for the second half of the school year. Lupe Fiasco calls this an energy, the last dragon endowed it at the Timac for the legendary glow. I sat at the foot of the stage for about 15 minutes, waiting for the other speakers, but so tuned out that I barely noticed who would join the stage with me, Pedro Noguera and Fairtest Bob Schaefer. Noguera's work with children of color had made him famous across the nation, particularly in New York City, where he consistently and publicly disagreed with the direction of public schools during the Bloomberg era. His independence as a researcher might have rubbed a few lefties the wrong way, but his presence at the march that year made a believer out of me. I saw how deeply he cared for kids and for the struggle he'd undertaken for better schools. I took a few deep breaths, nervous to be among so many people whose work I admired, people who had never heard of me, people who only knew me from my blogging. Loose. I regained my composure the minute I tapped the mic and said, testing, 1, 2. The audience let out a few giggles. A brisk wind rustled my pages and moved the sweat from my squinting eyes. The audience hummed. Not knowing what to expect, I let the hum take over. Whatever that energy was, I had simmered in its brew for about half an hour, and when the time came, I was ready to erupt. This is not a test. Welcome, America, to the latest installment of A People's March. For the next 3 minutes, I will ask you to defy protocol, disband the status quo, bust open these deformed gates, unlock the teacher's lounge, unlock the teacher's lounge, unlock the teacher's lounge. I beg your pardon, but I am not your proctor. I march with the protesters, and our hands are raised, a pledge for a new narrative. This is not a test. This is not a test, Mr. President. This is an assessment written against the idea that the dates and places of our history can be shrunk to the choice between B and C. And that is the purpose for this assembly, an extended response to a failed corporatist agenda, a reflection on the state of our most public of options measured through the rubric of human rights. But this is not a test. This is not a test, Mr. Duncan. Take note. This is not us asking. This is not us begging. This is not us pleading. This is us fighting for all things equal. This is us uniting as a more perfect union. This is us reminding America of a promissory note unpaid. This is us writing our own documentation when politicians refuse our kids the opportunity. We are all dreamers, and this is not a test. This is not a test, Mr. Bloomberg. This is the generation of children from the classrooms where teachers boldly stood and thought kids could learn. Educators stand firm, whether in cafeterias, mess halls, or prison halls. School is in session, and we submit our entire lives for millions of students a year. So even when I stand in front of the class, I am always children first. This is not a test. This is not a test, Ms. Ree. This is an exam unmoved by mayoral cycles. An eye, a bubble you cannot erase, a mouth you cannot tape, a heat you cannot beat. I come in the swarm of thousands, so I am a bee you cannot eat. This is not a test. This is not a test, Mr. President. Given an answer sheet, these students shaded in LOVE over ABCD, a set of standards commonly set forth before, acing geography by means instead of war, shaping the world henceforth. They will elevate our math to where the sum of the people is greater than the parts, becoming fluent in the languages of English, Spanish, and caring. America, please put down your pencils. This is not a test. This is not a test. This is not a test. The formers, you are dismissed. Thank you.